Hello, everyone. This is the 192nd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Scottish author Mr. Richard Hough discussing his book Verona Campione, The Miracle of 85. The book commemorating the 40th anniversary of Verona's Scudetto triumph in 1985. Welcome, Mr. Huff. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yeah, sure. It's great to speak to you. And in terms of soccer nostalgia, it doesn't really get much better than the 1984-85 season, certainly for me. As you said in your intro, I'm Scottish from Glasgow originally. Grew up in Glasgow. Was probably the only kid in Glasgow who used to wander about with an Aberdeen football strip on, which must have got me some strange looks in the 1980s. But I moved to Italy in 2011, and I've been a season ticket holder at Hellas Verona more or less ever since. Football has been a massive part of my life. Living here in Verona, both watching and playing and coaching and taking my kids. So yeah, football is a real central element to my life here in Verona, and obviously supporting the local team is a big part of that.
Let's get into your book. What was the inspiration, the trigger to write about this 1985 Verona story?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, I've been following Hellas for well over 10 years, been a season ticket holder, and then this year, obviously, we have the 40th anniversary of that famous Scudetto, so it just seemed like the right moment to tell this story. I've been writing about the football club and other aspects of life in Verona for a while now, and I've been wanting to tell a story because I think it is a football club with a really interesting and also very colourful and positive story to tell. Quite often when we talk about Hellas Verona in the modern context, it's has a negative perception. So I was really keen to try and get this incredible story from the 1980s, this beautiful story, the greatest underdog story probably in the history of football and the history of soccer, and bring that to a wider audience. It's a story that's extremely well known in Verona, as you can imagine, but outside of Italy, it's a story with a cast of characters, a supporting cast that includes Maradona, Platini, Zico, Socrates, Rummenigge, Paolo Rossi, and that's just the supporting cast. So it was a story that I was really keen to tell, and then I was fortunate enough to pitch it last summer to Pitch Publishing, who are the publishers, and they were really keen to get on board as well. So yeah, that's basically the origins, if you like.
What was the research process like and the duration to write this book? And can you name some of the protagonists that you managed to interview?
Yeah, I mean the research process and the writing was, I would say, short and intense because I only decided to write the book last summer. So it was always going to be a race against time. I wanted to get the book out in time for the 40th anniversary. So I knew it was going to be an intense period of research. But it was fun, it was challenging. Sometimes it's good in life to have that really intense deadline. Nothing sharpens your mind like having a looming deadline. So I got deep into the local newspaper archives, which was a lot of fun as well, going through the newspapers from the 1980s. There's so much going on in that period, on and off the pitch, and football journalism, football writing, the media around football is obviously completely different back then. So newspapers were basically the only real way of following football unless you were actually at the stadium. There was some televised football, but the YouTube footage from that era is pretty grainy. And then in terms of the players, the protagonists, the people I managed to interview, I spoke to as many of the players involved as I could in that short period of time. Guys like Domenico Volpatti, Di Gennaro, Tricella, Fana, Then also people who are on the periphery of the club who are either involved through family connections or through the youth team. For example, I spoke to Sergio Guidotti, whose dad was the president. He was involved in the youth team and on the periphery of the first team. And Gianluca Tavalin, who was also involved in the youth team, and he would go on to become a respected local journalist writing about football. But then, more importantly, perhaps, I also was really keen to speak to the fans because I wanted to try and tell this story from the fans' perspective as well, to try and get a sense of what it was like to be a fan back in those days. So I developed a questionnaire, put that out to a whole bunch of local fans who I knew were around at the time, and then interviewed a number of them as well. And that's where a lot of the emotion and colour and passion from this book comes from. It's their memories because they had guys who were maybe, and girls, who were maybe 12 or 13 or 17 years old at the time. And they have really vivid memories of that season, but I haven't really ever had the chance to talk about them or put them down on paper. So that was a really important part of the research. And just finally, one more thing, if I can just say, I was out for dinner last night with one of the fans from that era. He was 13 years old at the time, Nicholas Lignazzi, and we were at dinner last night. There was a group of us, husbands and wives and kids, so it was a convivial affair. And we were talking about football and talking about that era. And we were just reflecting on the fact that he was 13 when Verona won the championship. He saw, like I know you did, what he watched Italy win the World Cup in 1982. 3 years later, he saw his local team win the Scudetto. And then in 1990, Verona was a host city for the World Cup. So in the span of 8 years, from him being maybe 11 years old to 19 or 20, he'd seen those three events up close, the World Cup, the Scudetto, and then hosting the World Cup. And you can't imagine what that must have been like for a teenager growing up at that time, a football fan, those formative years. It was just an amazing period in his life. And I know from my own kids' experience, my oldest is 17. He's never seen Italy play in a World Cup. Never mind his local team in a Scudetto or his local city host a World Cup. So it's impossible to overstate, the impact that period had on the lives of those fans. And that's something that I've really tried to convey in this book.
It was certainly a magical time, even for those of us thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
Can you discuss the format of your book, whereby it's divided with each chapter devoted to each match day?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like quite an obvious way to structure a book that tells the story of a season into match days. And in fact, it's the approach that Tim Parks used in A Season with Verona. So that was a massive inspiration for me, Tim Parks' book. But at first, I hadn't intended to follow that structure. I'd started drafting the book, and it had a slightly different shape. It didn't have this match day sequence. But then I was at the beach kind of late last summer and just reading over some of my notes and reading over some of the early drafts. And I was thinking, the original draft, I'd started with a long kind of history of the social context and the politics and the economics and what Italian football was like. And it was just a bit turgid, to be honest. And I thought, this isn't really going to work. I need something that's going to have a bit more impact as an opening chapter, as an opening line. And that's when I thought, well, what's the most important thing that happens this season? How can I launch this book? And the first game of the season, that game at the Bentigodi against Napoli, seems like the obvious place to start. And that Maradona's first game in Italy, in Serie A, his first competitive game in Italy. And then the question that emerged, I happened to be reading the newspaper and realised that this was a conversation that took place around about that time. Who is going to mark Diego Maradona? That was a discussion that the coach Bagnoli and the players had been thinking about all week. And I thought that's the obvious and best and most interesting, most fun place to start. Who's going to mark Maradona? And then from that, it kind of followed this match day by match day structure. But what I wanted to do as well is to thread in a little bit of history, a little bit of context, some deep dives into the players, a bit of culture, a bit of history of the opposition club, what was their status, where did they come from? So it's not just a blow by blow account of the games. There's a bit more to it than that.
Yeah, and I would like to stress that in each chapter, you don't just discuss the events on the field of the particular match day. You use that to tell the story and the trajectory of the protagonists. You discuss the social history of Italy and many other relevant historical events on and off the field
Yeah.
happening at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes the actual discussion about the match itself is just a couple of paragraphs. If it's like a 0-0 against Cremonese or something, there's not a lot to say. You can't write 3,000 words on that. And I didn't want to. I wanted it to be a bit more about what else was going on. And some of the rabbit holes you can disappear down, believe me, are pretty incredible. So I wanted to give context, but then I also wanted to stay as focused as possible on the key protagonists and the key arc of the story.
Let's go back in time. What was the status of Hellas Verona in the Italian cultural landscape as we come to the decade of the 1980s?
Verona were struggling, you could say, the 1970s. They had a couple of iconic players during that period. They had guys like Zigoni, Maschetti, and Bergomaschi playing for them. So they weren't a bad team. They weren't great. They were a mid-table Serie A team, mid to lower end of the table. They would came up and down a couple of times in the 1970s into Serie B. But it was a club that was really in the doldrums, I would suggest. Attendances were probably in the mid 20,000, 22,000, 23,000, maybe averaging something like that, compared to 46,000 who would turn out in the mid 1980s. So it was a club that was struggling a wee bit, struggling to find its identity, struggling to compete against the bigger clubs, the Juves or Milan's, Torino. But it was a club with some potential. We had the Bentigodi Stadium, which was a pretty impressive stadium for that era. Verona is an affluent, wealthy city with very, very loyal football fans, massive appetite for football. So it was a club with potential, but untapped potential, I think you could say, going into the 1980s.
What had been the trajectory of the central character in the story, the manager Osvaldo Bagnoli, upon his appointment as a Verona manager in 1981?
Yeah, I mean, he's a very, very interesting character. And as you said, probably the central protagonist, the central character in this, or one of the central characters in this story. Without Osvaldo Bagnoli, Hellas Verona don't win the Scudetto. It's as simple as that. So he was a key figure. As a manager, as a player to start off with, I mean, he was a decent player with a long career, if unspectacular. He began his playing career at Milan, but never really took off for him there. So he was a bit of a journeyman player. He played up and down the peninsula, including in the late 1950s for Verona. And it was there he found his future wife. So that playing in Verona, marrying someone from Verona, that really gave him this lifelong affinity for the city, which would be important later when he returned to the city to coach the club. So as a player, unspectacular but highly respected. He played for clubs like Catanzaro, per Verbania. He was a decent goal scoring midfielder. Managerial career was up until coming to Verona was similar. He was, managed at clubs like Como, Cesena. He was a coach at Cesena as well. Very bizarrely, he won promotion with Cesena into Serie A, but then chose at the end of that season to come and coach Hellas Verona, who were struggling in Serie B at that point. And so quite idiosyncratic character, quite a quiet, reserved guy, but with a wealth of footballing knowledge up and down the peninsula. He knew the game inside out. He knew all the players, emerging talent, guys who'd been forgotten about, young guys who'd been discarded by bigger clubs. So he knew the game extremely well. And he was a revolutionary, is maybe too strong, but he was all the players I have spoken to said he was an outstanding coach. A man of very few words, but few words, and just a few words he could convey what he wanted to his players. And so, yeah, instrumental really in everything that Verona would go on to achieve.
Other personalities off the field who may be unknown to most, but are nevertheless important in this story are club president Celestino Guidotti and the sporting director, essentially the wheeler dealer in the transfer market, Emiliano Maschetti. How important were they in the story?
Yeah, the backroom team, the boardroom, if you like, they were crucial as well. And the fact that you had the correct coach in Bagnoli, you had this president who was a local businessman, respected guy, charismatic. He was very popular with the fans. He would go around all the fan club dinners in the provinces and in the city. He would usually be the last one standing at these dinners. So he was a extremely popular character, but with a purpose and with a belief and a project. And Maschetti as well was a club legend. He'd been an important player for the club, highly respected player. And then as a sporting director and chief scout, he was instrumental in bringing some of the outstanding talent that began to arrive in Verona following the appointment of Bagnoli in 1981. So yeah, these guys, it was just everyone was in the right place at the right time, from the in the boardroom to the coach, and then the players started to arrive as well. So you could see that by the early 1980s, things were beginning to take shape.
One of the abiding memories of this era is Verona with their Adidas kits and Canon as sponsors. So
Yeah,
they were responsible for the arrival of this Japanese firm, and that helped them, I imagine, with the funds for transfers
yeah,
in the years to
absolutely. I mean,
come.
that's crucial as well. Without the Canon sponsorship, it's difficult to see how Verona would be able to attract players like Brigo and Elkier, who I'm sure we'll come on to talk about. So yeah, that sponsorship is fundamental. And the shirt as well, it's iconic. It remains an iconic style and design. And to this day in Verona, on match day, you'll see people in that strip, those colours. It's, yeah, crucial.
The origin of this story starts while Verona are still in Serie B in the 1981-82 season and are promoted and then have a surprisingly good season as a promoted side in 1982-83 where they finish fourth, I believe. Can you discuss the importance of these few years in the evolution of the 1985 Scudetto winning side?
Yeah, absolutely correct. These years were crucial. These were the years with the appointment of Bagnoli in 1981. He won immediate promotion. The previous season, Verona had been languishing. I think they finished in 16th place in Serie B. Bagnoli's impact was immediate. He turned the club around. He won promotion in his first season. And then, amazingly, as you said, finished fourth in their first season back in Serie A, and played some of the best football they played in that entire era that season. So almost immediately when Bagnoli's appointment, they begin to bring in players who would go on to form the championship winning team. So these years are crucial each season. It's kind of gradual progress, you could say, that they're bringing in two or three players each season. Amongst the first to arrive is Garella and Antonio Di Gennaro. So they have the goalkeeper and the playmaker. So gradually, Bagnoli's team is beginning to take shape. Results on the pitch are also extremely impressive. The first season back in Serie A, I think they lost the first two games, but then went on an incredible 17-game unbeaten run. They reached the final of the Coppa Italia 2 years in a row, and they qualified for Europe, obviously, on the back of that fourth place finish. So these are really unprecedented results for a provincial club like Hellas Verona to be competing with the very, very strongest and best teams in Italy, some of the best players in the world beginning to be drawn to Italy. So these years are fundamental in bringing together a group of players who would form an incredible bond between them. squads in those days were extremely small by today's standards. The team that won the championship had only 16 players. You'd only allowed two foreigners. So the squad that Bagnoli constructed was extremely close, extremely compact. They became lifelong friends. You see them even to this day. They enjoy spending time together. They have this incredible bond. So yeah, those years were really crucial in the development of that team.
We should mention that the libero Roberto Tricella had been there before Bagnoli got there, but others, like you said, in 1981-82 season, there's the arrival of Antonio Di Gennaro and Claudio Garella. Also, Domenico Penzo, who would be a key striker, but then would leave the club before this Scudetto winning season. So for that 82-83 season, I would say for some big chunk of the season, they were actually second behind Roma
Yeah, yeah,
until they fell away towards the end. But of course, they reached the final of the Coppa Italia, but they lost to Juventus. So for that 82-83 season, they bring in other players like the Brazilian Dirceu, who stays for a short time, but more importantly, someone like Pietro Fana, who comes from Juventus, Luciano Marangon arrives from Roma, Luigi Sacchetti from Fiorentina, and Domenico Volpatti, of course, who would be a jack of all trades sort of player for Verona. He was from Brescia, as well as the Polish Vladislav Zmuda. The following season, 83-84, while they don't finish as high, they finish sixth, I believe, and reach the final of Coppa Italia. Nevertheless, it's a season where they are consolidating their place in the Serie A. You have the arrivals of players such as Mauro Ferroni, Silvano Fontolan, Francesco Guidolin, who would have a solid coaching career, and
yeah,
others like Giuseppe Galderisi, who was underused at Juventus, as well as Maurizio Iorio from Roma. Not forgetting Scottish striker Joe Jordan, who arrived from AC
yeah.
Milan, but I don't think he played as much. But the team is stabilizing while obviously not being regarded as the top echelon of the Serie A.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the project is taking shape, but nobody is ever really thinking of Verona as a potential championship winning team. People are beginning to take notice, so you can't say they came from nowhere in the 84-85 season. They didn't come from nowhere. They had built their way up and were playing good football. They had some fantastic players, albeit they weren't household names, but they were quality players, guys that you mentioned. Roberto Tricella had been released by Inter as a youngster and came to Verona in the late 1970s. And he was an extremely competent defender, sweeper, brilliant player, and would become the captain of the team very, very, very early, at a very young age. And Pierino Fana was another one, outstandingly talented, released by Juventus. He'd already won the championship with Juventus three times, albeit as a kind of squad player. And he would go on to win the championship, obviously, with Verona and then again with Inter. So he's one of very few guys who have won the Scudetto with three different clubs. Outrageously talented player. And then guys like Domenico Volpatti was just a brilliant, versatile, intelligent, hungry, focused player as well, and really crucial. He was seen very much as the big brother of the dressing room. He would go on to be a dentist of all things, he'd continue his medical studies after his playing career. And he was really crucial, him and Tuchella, in creating the dressing room environment that was more like a family. It's a cliche to say it, but it was more like a group of close friends, brothers, siblings, than actually a group of players. And that was crucial to what Verona achieved, I think, because you had other teams, you had Napoli, you had Inter, you had Juve, who are investing big time in players, but they just couldn't quite make them click in the same way. But one of the key aspects of Verona's success was the fact that they brought these players together and they gelled extremely well on and off the pitch.
For the 1984-85 season, We'd have the arrivals of Luciano Marangon's brother Fabio from Alessandria and Franco Turchetta from Varese. With an established Italian backbone in place, now the key decision would be on the two foreign players for the remaining spots. And let's remind everyone that around this time, this is a pre-Bozeman era where only two foreign players were allowed per club. It would be the two key and efficient foreign signings that would perhaps propel Verona to win the Scudetto for the 1984-85 seasons. So, how were the signings of the West German Hans-Peter Briegel, or the Panzer as he was known, and
Yeah.
the Danish striker Preben Elkjær regarded in a summer of 1984, where we saw the likes of Maradona, Rummenigge, Socrates, Graham Souness, Junior, Wilkins, among others, joining the Serie A?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Italy at that time was like a magnet for the world's greatest players. And Elkjær and Brigo probably weren't on that elite upper tier level, really. Elkjær was a renowned goal scorer for the Danish national team. He just came off the back of a very impressive Euro 84 campaign. So he was someone who was considered top player, albeit he was playing for Lokeren in Belgium, so he was perhaps underperforming for his club team. Brigo was again a quality player, left back, playing for the West German national team, but not regarded probably in the same, perhaps because of the position he played, but not regarded at the same level as somebody like Rummenigge, who had gone to Inter. But in Verona, looking through the local newspapers around the period when they were signed, these guys coming to Verona, it was regarded as a massive coup. They were unquestionably top quality players who would bring some pace and power and experience to the Verona team. So they were signings that were very well received here, albeit the Gazzetta, I think, made a mistake with the photograph. It showed Elkjær, but it used an image of one of the other Danish players. So they made a little faux pas with that one. But highly regarded players. I don't think anyone really expected them to go on and have the impact that they would, because they were, I think, and again, this is borne out by the newspaper archives at the time who made this exact point. They were the two foreigners that season who had the biggest impact in the league. So despite the fact that you had the arrival of Rummenigge at Inter and Maradona at Napoli, it was Elkjær and Brigo who had the biggest and most effective impact, mainly in terms of goals and mainly in terms of key goals at crucial points in crucial games. But they integrated, adapted extremely well to this change in country. Coming to Italy isn't always easy for foreign players, but they were immediately embraced by the Verona dressing room, immediately embraced by the fans, and they have a lifelong affinity with the club and the city. Elkjær is still regarded as the Sindaco, they call him, the mayor. So whenever he comes, he gets a hero's welcome, as do all the players from that era. But yeah, the fact that they hit the ground running really from day one, that game against Napoli, Briegel is decisive. He marks Maradona out of the game and he scores a goal himself as Verona win that opening match 3-1. So yeah, the foreign signings are again the right players at the right place at the right time.
Interestingly, in a sliding doors moment, Elkjær could have joined Paris Saint-Germain in 1984. But their president, Francis Borelli, he preferred the Austrian striker Richard Niederbacher, who he deemed to be younger and better. So, yeah, they didn't sign Elkjær.
Elkjær was a bit of a gamble, because he was, I think, 27 when he came. So yeah, maybe you could say beyond his peak, maybe. But in fact, he was just reaching his peak. But also, he had a certain reputation that followed him wherever he went. So yeah, he was a bit of a gamble, but he had an immediate rapport with Bagnoli, even though they could barely communicate. But he understood immediately what Bagnoli wanted. Bagnoli understood immediately how to handle someone like Elkier, who was this rebellious figure. He liked to smoke and drink, and he wasn't always he was like to have a laugh and a joke. A fantastic personality. But yeah, something of a gamble in terms of his temperament and his lifestyle.
For a club like Verona, the declared objective is always Serie A survival. But do you think, given their two previous seasons, they may have looked higher?
Yeah, probably. Although, I mean, throughout that 84, 85 season, Bagnoli, or throughout the first half, Bagnoli would always insist they were just trying to ensure their place in Serie A the following season. So publicly, anyway, he set the objectives pretty low. But yeah, you can't say that they finished fourth, they finished sixth, back-to-back Coppa Italia finals. They were capable of decent things. They were capable of a top five finish. They were capable of reaching finals. So yes, I think other clubs were beginning to take notice. They were preparing better for games against Verona, knowing that it wouldn't be a walkover. But nobody ever mentioned a potential championship winning challenge. That was just not on the radar at all at the start of the season, or even the first half of the season. Once the string of results came together, the question was asked, could this team win the championship? But Bagnoli was always very quick to dismiss such suggestions. But, with hindsight, you can see that, it was a club that was on a very sharp upward trajectory with a solid group of players. So anything was possible.
Yuri referenced this a few times. The adventure starts on September 16th, 1984, as Verona are hosting Napoli of Diego Maradona. And naturally, all the focus was on Maradona's debut. But in the end, it turned out to be a statement of purpose by Verona as they won 3-1 and were already league leaders. Psychologically, how important was this first win?
Yeah, it was massive, and quite unexpected. I think that everyone was expecting this to be the Maradona show, but it was an early indication, not least for Maradona, that it wasn't going to be easy to come to Italy and to come to a club like Napoli and achieve great things. That would take a few years. It would take a project. It would take a different group of players around him. And Maradona would have to get used to the Italian style of play, and Napoli would have to work out how to get the best out of him. For Verona, of course, it's a big psychological boost. Winning the first game of the season is always a big one, especially against a southern rivals like Napoli. To win it quite convincingly as well, 3-1 with Brigo on the score sheet was really crucial. Gaderizzi scores, as does Di Gennaro. So a really convincing win that gives the club a massive boost. Verona don't always start the season well, so this is a good, impressive start to the season, but nothing more than that. At that point, we're still not even in the realms of talking about a possible championship run. But yeah, a fantastic start.
Verona followed with wins over Ascoli and Udinese before facing off against Inter on October 7th, where Brigel faced off against his West German compatriot Karl-Heinz Rummenigge. Verona came away with a precious scoreless tie away from home. And as you mentioned, even though it's still early, do you think the observers are starting to take notice?
Yeah, it's impossible not to, because Verona at this point are top of the league. They have gone the Inter game they've won the first three games, which I think was the first time Verona had ever won the first three league games in Serie A. They bring a point back from the San Siro. I think, to be honest, Bagnoli had been hoping to bring back 2 points. Remember, it's 2 points for a win back then. But Verona have never won at the San Siro, and that record continues to this day. It's a stadium that Verona never win at. So bringing home a point from the San Siro still top of the league after 4 games. Observers are certainly, they have to, the newspapers have to talk about Verona because they're top of the league. You can't ignore them. But again, it's seen more as, okay, this is a good start by a decent team, but the situation will resolve itself. Normal service will be resumed. There's only so long Verona can maintain a run like this.
It was perhaps the win against defending champions Juventus in the following week on October 14th that certainly gave an indication of the team's winning potential. This is the famous match when Preben Elker scored with one shoe. Was this, in a way, the reference match?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Match day 5. It's a really tough run of games that Verona are involved in at this point in the season. They've just been to the San Siro. They've got Juve. They face Roma the following week, and then Fiorentina the week after that. So this is like a really horrendous run of games, and that could make or break Verona's season even at this early stage. So to win that game convincingly 2-0 at home, Galderizzi scores again. Larson, that incredible goal, which has really become the most celebrated goal from that entire era. The fact that he managed to score against Juve, who were the dominant team of the era, the fact that he manages to do it with just having lost his shoe in the build-up, it's a goal that is still celebrated to this day in the city. You can buy the T-shirt, the Gol Senza Scarpa. So yeah, a really iconic moment in the course of the season, a statement victory against Juventus, and the fact that this crazy character Elkier has scored such an incredible goal, it becomes one of the defining moments of the entire season.
As we reach the midpoint of the season, Verona has consolidated its lead at the top, with Inter seemingly their most serious rival at this point. Verona has come away with precious ties at Roma, as well as wins over Fiorentina, away at Lazio and Torino, among others. They would suffer their first defeat of the season only on match day 15 against Avellino. In this period, Elker is out due to injury, and Bagnoli has to contend with other injuries and has to present sometimes makeshift squads, some players playing out of position, but nevertheless, they maintain their lead. Was this a further reflection of the strength of the team that these setbacks did not affect their results as much?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the absence of Elkier for significant spell during that autumn winter period is a real blow to the club. And as I mentioned earlier, the squad is pretty threadbare. There are barely 16 players in the squad, so there's not a lot of room for manoeuvre. But Bagnoli is an extremely pragmatic coach who can get the best out of his players. And the guys who are on the periphery of the squad, guys like Luigi Sacchetti, who's just returning from injury, Luciano Bruni, and Franco Turchetta. These are guys who come in and do incredibly well, do exactly what they're asked to do. Obviously, they're not Elkier, but they do a great job and ensure that things don't begin to slide during what could have been a potentially difficult period in the season. And again, it's testimony to the group and the spirit that Bagnoli has created. These players who are on the periphery of the squad, they know exactly what's required of them. They seize the moment. They give everything, and yeah, that's a crucial part of the story that season.
In the second half of the season, Verona start to pull away from the chasing pack. There's that win at Udinese on February 10th, a 5-3 scoreline, which is very uncharacteristic of the defensive culture of the day.
Yeah,
And this was also another reference point as the team is remaining unbeaten still in the second half of the season. And at some point, they build up a maximum of a 6 point lead. Again, this is a 2 points for a win era, so 6 points is significant at this point. Do you remember when the serious talk about Verona as potential champions started?
Yeah, I mean, everybody, every player, every fan has a slightly different take on when they thought the championship was possible. For some, it's quite early in the season, as early even as that 2-0 victory against Juventus, when they realised something miraculous is possible. For others, it's the 5-3 game against Udinese because Verona went 3-0 up in that game. Udinese, who had Zico playing for them, came back three each. And at that point, that could have been a turning point in the season. The league was still pretty close at that point, just 1 point difference with Inter. But Verona dug deep, and it was Berigo and Elkier who scored the two decisive goals in that game as Verona won 5-3. So for many, that was a kind of statement of this Verona club team has the capacity to overcome adversity, to seize the moment, to seize the momentum, and grind out an impressive 5-3 result, which, as you said, completely uncharacteristic result for that period in time when goals were often just, 1-0, 0-0, 2-1 fairs. It wasn't pretty high scoring football. For others, it would maybe come slightly later, bringing back a point from Turin in February. For others, no, Bagnoli refused to talk about a possible championship title until April. He was extremely superstitious. He didn't let his players use the word. Pierino Fana famously made a rather out of character and brash declaration when the players gathered together during the Christmas holidays. They gathered together in Cavallese in the Italian Alps for a New Year's celebration, and he stood up and said, I paraphrase, but he stood up and said, "This is our season, lads." So each player, each individual had a slightly different moment when they realised it was possible. For me, going through the archives and as a writer and going through it, I never actually I thought, they can't do this, it's not possible. I was, right until the very end, I was thinking, how on earth? I was just waiting for a collapse. And of course, the global media, the big clubs, the opposing fans, they're all expecting this collapse to happen as well, because Verona wouldn't be the first team that lost on the last day of the season or had a collapse in form in the last couple of weeks or months. So for some, it was right until the penultimate games, the game against Como, the game against Atalanta. For some, they refused to believe it was possible until the very end.
In this second half of the season, also Inter slowly lose pace as they're still involved in Europe in the UEFA Cup. You see Torino becoming their nearest challengers. And Verona has a minor hiccup on match day 25 on April 14 as they lose at home to Torino 2-1. And this would be their second and last loss in this season. Despite this loss, do you think realistically, as far as the other teams were concerned, the title was already wrapped up at this point?
I think it's probably a bit early to say that the title was wrapped up by the 14th of April. With Verona losing, that gave a glimmer of hope to clubs like Torino and to Inter, who are still in contention. Inter's problem was they just lacked consistency at the key moments in the season. Juve were focusing on Europe that season, but you could never, I feel, dismiss a club like Juve with players like Platini, who's winning the Ballon d'Or back-to-back seasons. So again, when I'm writing the book, I'm always looking at the league table and going, where are Juve? What are they doing? Where are they? Because they can grind out results and they can. They had a terrible start to the season, but they were always hovering, lurking there, just below, ready to capitalise if Verona made a mistake. So yeah, I think it's still a little bit too early at that point to think it's all over. Torino were still going for it. That was a morale boosting win for them. So some of the Torino players were confident that they could still grab something if Verona still had some tough games. They still had to go to Milan. They had a game against Lazio and Como. Okay, they weren't great. But there was still half a dozen games to go, 5 games to go. anything was possible at that point. Verona could still throw it away.
They would grind out results. The following week, they came away with a scoreless tie against AC Milan. And a week after that, there's that important win over Lazio with Pietro Fana scoring near the end to give this morale boosting win, which may, in some ways, may have more or less settled the title. But then the following week, they're at home, they drop a point against Como with a scoreless tie. So they're just getting closer and closer. Maybe not in an impressive fashion, but they are getting closer.
It's not spectacular at this point, but it's basically just about doing what's necessary to get the point. And that's, when they begin to show a bit of steel and a bit of character. And you can't believe the pressure that the club and the players and the manager is under at this point. There's an enormous pressure building around the club as expectations begin to raise, and they know they only need to get a point here, 2 points there. The pressure is enormous. So being able to deal with that pressure and to grind out results at that crucial point in the season is another key aspect of the season.
So we come to the penultimate match day of the season, match day 29 on May 12th, 1985. And Verona secured the Scudetto with a 1-1 tie at Atalanta, with Preben Elker scoring the tying goal. So, how did the city celebrate such a historic moment?
Yeah, it was pretty wild by all accounts. Atalanta Bergamo is just along the road. It's like maybe an hour and a quarter drive. So there was a massive convoy that went from Verona to Bergamo for the game, and then a massive convoy that came back from Bergamo. Half of the city's population, it seems, had decamped to Bergamo that afternoon. The other half were in Piazza Bra, which is the massive big piazza in the city centre that's got the Roman arena, fountains, massive big public space. And they were broadcasting the radio commentary from the balcony of the radio station across the piazza. So massive crowds were assembling in the piazza. The players went out for dinner after the game and then arrived back in Verona later that night, obviously straight to Piazza Bra, which was just a wash with fans, yellow, blue. People were in the fountain, just wild scenes. Guys who I interviewed for the book who were maybe like 16 or 17 years old at the time. They'd never experienced anything like it. For them, it was the greatest party that they'd ever seen. Just wild scenes, jubilation. And that continued all week, basically. There was still the last game of the season to play at home against Avellino. So the players were allowed to celebrate, but were then back in training on Monday morning. The fans, though, really were partying hard all week, from what I understand, and then preparing themselves for the last game of the season, the home game, be the kind of the finale. But yeah, wild scenes. A party like Verona has never seen before or since.
And they would win that final match on May 19th against Avellino 4-2 to cap off an impressive season. Like we mentioned earlier, losing only two matches the entire season, which
Yeah.
is impressive in itself. They won half their matches, so 15 wins, 13 ties, and yeah, only those two losses. Verona's impressive season and also the couple of previous seasons before that paved the way for players like Tricella, Fana, Antonio Di Gennaro, and Giuseppe Galderizzi to earn a place with the Italian national team until the Mexico World Cup in 1986. So at this point, Antonio Di Gennaro was established as the regista, replacing Giancarlo Antonioni, while the younger Giuseppe Galderizzi edged ahead of the fading Paolo Rossi at this point. And Tricella was at this point looked upon as an heir apparent to Gaetano Scirea. So was it inevitable that they would be called up after such a historical season?
Yeah, I suppose so. And again, not just one season. It wasn't just on the back of that season, but on the back of two or three seasons when these players had all really overperformed. They were in the form of their lives. Guys like Cucella, who would go on to Inter, Fana as well. Calderisi was always a outstanding talent. So these guys were in the form of their lives. And so, yeah, I think it was inevitable that they would get a call up. Italy, a team that had won the World Cup in 1982, was, I guess, beginning to fade. These guys had been around, these legends of the game, like Zoff and Paolo Rossi, who you mentioned. There was a sense that their reign was coming to an end. So Italy were looking for the next generation of fans, and Verona were playing the best football in Italy at that point. They were playing a brand of football which was vertical, direct, aggressive, effective. You know, they were winning important games, and these players were crucial to that. It never really worked out for any of them, maybe with the exception of Di Gennaro, who for a while was an important player in the Italian national team. But guys like Fana and Tuchella and Galderisi, they got a handful of caps, mainly in friendlies. I mean, the fact that they went to the World Cup in Mexico '86, the fact that you have this group of players from a club like Verona who are providing a substantial group of players for a World Cup squad is something to celebrate. It's something that hasn't really happened before or since. Very few Verona players make the Italian national team. Can think of maybe guys like Zacchini in recent years who had a call up, but very few and far between. So again, it's an important aspect of this era. It's a golden age for Hellas Verona Football Club with our best players appearing in the Azzurri shirt.
However, reality soon caught up with Verona, and financially, the team could not compete with stronger teams. Pietro Fana and Luciano Marangon were transferred to Inter, in fact, during the season, while Claudio Garella joined Maradona and Napoli, and he would win another Scudetto in 1987 with Napoli. Was it self evident that this would be a one off and the team just could not build upon on this triumph?
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately that is what happened. You know, when these massive offers come in for ambitious young players, it's almost inevitable that they are going to accept these offers to go to bigger clubs. It's unfortunate. Football was changing. 1985, in some ways, I think, is a turning point in the game as the financial, the money involved in football clubs. Berlusconi arrives in Milan the next season. Clubs like Napoli and Inter have got a lot of money to spend. Verona can't really compete on that level. Players are extremely ambitious. They know they've got short careers. You have the emergence of agents who are looking to get the best financial deals for their players. I mean, some of these players regret leaving. I know Pierino Fana regrets going to Inter. He wishes he had stayed on at Verona because he believes if that group had stayed together, they could have done even more. But that's life, isn't it? That's football. It's one of the compelling things about this story, I think, is that it is this rise and fall, rise and decline story. It would be amazing if they had managed to maintain that level of form and keep the best players at the club. But that's not Hellas Verona. You know, the joy of Hellas Verona is sometimes the suffering that you have to do and the acknowledgement that bigger clubs are often going to come in for your best players.
Strange as it may seem, only 5 years later, in 1990, the team was relegated, and that was the end of the Bagnoli era.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, they just could not sustain with all the big powers, all the Maradonas, the Berlusconi with the three Dutchmen, and all that, and all the talent drain year after year.
It was tough. Verona had probably overextended themselves financially during those years, trying to maintain that quality, trying to maintain on the pitch what they had achieved in 84, 85, but they overextended themselves. They didn't have access to the resources that other clubs had. And yeah, it was a pretty tragic downfall in the end.
Osvaldo Bagnoli, he later had success with another unfancied side, Genoa. and qualified the team to the UEFA Cup to show that this title was no fluke. What can you say about his impact and his management style that was obviously sustainable in other situations as well, other
Yeah,
contexts as well?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. He had a great run at Genoa afterwards, leading them into Europe. A famous game against Liverpool, doing some really great finishes for Genoa in the league as well in those years. He went on to Inter and was quite unceremoniously sacked at Inter, and the Inter president at the time would later say that it was the biggest regret of his career that he sacked Bagnoli because he thinks if he'd given him a bit more time, he could have been a great coach there as well. But Bagnoli was this kind of idiosyncratic character. He didn't particularly want fame or fortune. He wanted to be remembered as a football player as much as a coach. And he loved being part of a dressing room. He loved the relationship he had with his players. They considered him to be a father figure. I, I was at an event recently where Pierino Fana was speaking, and he told this story of how the players got together a few years later for a charity match, and it was a terrible day. It had been raining. The pitch was full of puddles. None of the players particularly wanted to play. But Bagnoli arrived. He was by this point already pretty old, and his kit ran onto the pitch with the enthusiasm of a child, and that again just really inspired the players. So they all got involved, and they had a good game. But Bagnoli had this effect on him. He was a father figure, and the players just wanted to play well for him and to please him. But he was a great tactician as well, pragmatic, adaptable. Each of the seasons he was at Verona from 1981, he adapted to his formation to suit the players that he had. Always quite aggressive and forward thinking. He didn't like possession based football. He wanted the ball to go from his goalkeeper or defender to his centre forward in as few passes as possible. He said he wants, in 3 passes, he wants his striker to have the ball in front of the opposition net. That was his overriding football philosophy: play forward fast. But yeah, a really endearing character, and one who he's in suffers from dementia, so he's very rarely seen in public at the moment, but still a highly revered figure in the city and the author really of Verona's greatest footballing triumph.
Getting back to the 1984-85 season, many feel that the refereeing selection policy that season was a reason that the team like Verona might have had a fair fight against the big boys as far as winning the title. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's no coincidence, is it, that in the season where referees are appointed randomly, a minor club wins the championship, and then immediately after, the big club's obviously not happy at the outcome. They revert back to a slightly more opaque system for appointing referees. I mean, I think there's no doubt really that Verona won that season on merit. The other clubs had other problems that weren't really related to refereeing decisions. It was more about integrating their new players. Napoli had to work out how to play with Maradona. Inter didn't really get the best out of Rummenigge. They lacked consistency. Sampdoria were a team that were emerging, but Verona were basically just the most consistent team over the course of the season with the best group of players. So yeah, the refereeing thing is it's a great one for the conspiracy theorists, and there are many of those in Italian football community. But yeah, I don't particularly think it made that much difference. But then you never know, do you? You never know what goes on in these darkened corridors, and there's been no shortage of scandal and corruption over the years with match fixing and referee impropriety. So yeah, anything is possible in Italy.
How would you compare this 1985 Verona story to other triumphs by unfancied sides, such as Cagliari of Gigi Riva in 1970 and of course the Sampdoria of Vialli and Mancini in 1991.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely valid comparisons when smaller clubs like Cagliari and Sampdoria. I mean, Sampdoria in the 1990s is a fantastic story as well. They had significant financial investment, so they were able to bring some great players. You obviously Mancini and Viale, and you had Sunis there as well. You had some fantastic players at Sampdoria during that period. So yeah, these are super valid comparisons. But for me, the greatest upset it will always be that 1984-85 season, just because Verona, a completely unfancied side, but then also the teams and the players that they were up against. The fact that Verona won it that season, for me, it's simply the biggest sporting upset in history.
In England, it's often referenced how in 1981, when Aston Villa won the title, I believe they only used like 14 players.
Yeah,
So you could make, obviously, this was more than 14 players, but you could kind of make a similar comparison with this whole idea of the types of Volpati and Turqueta or whoever would sometimes be inserted in this position, that position, just to fill in the
yeah.
gaps.
I mean, I think even if you talk about Leicester in 2016, you hear a similar kind of narrative, which is it was a small group of players, albeit small in the context of the Premier League in 2015-16 is different to small in 1985, but also extremely close knit, extremely effective, charismatic manager, and this kind of mismatch of players, some of whom are journeymen and discards and rejects, and bringing all that together. But then also the word that is often used as well about both Verona and Leicester is like a family. There was this kind of family feeling around the changing room. It was like playing with a group of friends. And I think that's crucial if you're going to play against the best players in the world, big clubs like Inter and Juve, then the only way you can compete really is by creating this bond between the players. And that's something that Bagnoli did extremely effectively at Verona and as Ranieri did in Leicester.
In the cases of Brigel and Elker, was it a case of foreign players immediately adapting and gelling with their teammates, in contrast to many other foreign players who failed to adapt despite all their talents?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fundamental. The fact that Brigo and Elkia hit the ground running, they embraced the Italian lifestyle. Elkia, loved dressing like an Italian, drinking like an Italian, eating like an Italian, speaking like an Italian. Brigo was a bit less quick to pick up the language, but he was immediately embraced by the dressing room. And those two guys, they lived together during that season on Lake Garda. They travelled together to training. They really threw themselves into the atmosphere in the dressing room. Bagnoli wanted his players to enjoy themselves, to express themselves on and off the pitch, and both Brigo and Elkia were able to do that. Where so many other players really struggled. There's countless cases of foreigners coming to Italy and just really struggling. Some of them eventually they managed to fit in. Some of them, the Scottish guy Dennis Law is a famous example. Ian Rush, countless examples of players who just Gascoigne, I suppose you could argue as well. Countless examples of foreign players who just never really managed to adapt to the Italian way of life and the Italian way of playing, whereas Elker and Brigo embraced it, loved it, and the results were there on the pitch for all to see.
As much as this 1985 Verona story is a Cinderella story, we have to say that there was linear progression from Serie B to finishing fourth in their first season Serie A and being in the title race for the big chunk of that 1982-83 season. So is this part sometimes overlooked in the discussion of the story?
Yes, And I'm as guilty as anyone of that. I've got the book here, and the subtitle of the book, as you can see, is The Miracle of '85. And I rather foolishly, I wrote the title and the subtitle of the book before I wrote the book. And I quite like the title, even though it's not, I don't think, borne out by events. The Miracle of '85. I don't think it's fair to call this a miracle. Maybe it was miraculous, the fact that a club like Verona won the championship, but this was a project, one that began in 1981, as you said, with the appointment of Bagnoli and the immediate impact he has, and then the gradual development of the squad and the Coppa Italia finals, the top four, top five finishes year on year. So yeah, it is something that you tend to forget, that it wasn't that Verona came from nowhere. There was this build up. There was this 2 or 3 seasons where Verona were emerging as a real force in Italian football. So yeah, absolutely, it's something that we sometimes forget, and I was as guilty as anyone of that as well. The story around those 2 or 3 seasons is really, really fascinating. It's not just the 84, 85 season that you have to consider. You have to look at the wider context as well.
In closing, what is the ultimate romance of this story? Is it a tale of a smaller team overachieving against the strong, a team being bigger than some of its parts? What resonates about this story 40 years later that we are still talking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, the thing that resonates most is, and it kind of always never fails to kind of catch my breath, is the fact that not only did Verona win the Scudetto, but they did so against Platini, Maradona, Rummenigge, Zico, Socrates, Falcao. You could go on, all the Italian legends from the 1982 World Cup that were still playing in Serie A at that point. So for me, it's a classic David against Goliath. It's an underdog beating these global superstars, these massive forces in Italian football, Juve, Inter, Napoli, Torino, and Roma. Roma were at this point a major force in Italian football as well. So yeah, for me, that's the essence of the story. It's the fact that Verona did this against all the odds, against some of the greatest names, some of the most charismatic players to ever play football. They were all in Italy that season, and that for me is what makes this such an amazing story. I could have written a book about Maradona's time in Italy, or about Socrates, or about any number of different players, because you go down rabbit holes with these guys. They were such compelling characters on and off the pitch. So for me, yeah, the essence of the story is that Verona, with, okay, they had Elker and Brigo, but the average Italian football fan would struggle to name any of the other players in that team. So they weren't superstars, but like you say, the sum of their parts was bigger than the individuals concerned, and they achieved, for want of a better word, a miracle. Albeit anyone who studies the victory knows that it wasn't luck, it wasn't a fluke, it was hard work and quality players and good management and all these other things that we've been speaking about today.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Hough's book, Verona Campione, The Miracle of 85. The link is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Richard, thank you once again. It was a very fascinating discussion. Again, it's a story that as a fan, I lived through as well, as a young fan following this story at the time. So it certainly resonated with me, and I would encourage everyone, young or old, to read through your wonderful book that traces this story. So thank you
Thanks.
once again.
Well, thank you, Shahan. Really appreciate that, and the depth and detail of your questions as well. It's been really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.